I'm very pleased to be joined by Trent Ameneker from DIU today in the Cipher Brief studio. Trent, welcome.
Thanks, Brad. It's good to be here.
Um, the issue of emerging technology and national security and warfare is one that we are just really focused on here at the Cipher Brief. One area in particular that's just continuing to dominate headlines and attract all sorts of attention is, relates to drones or UAS, however, folks want to refer to them. And so that's kind of what we wanted to speak with you about today. And I just wondered if we could maybe start with a general high-level view of what DIU is focused on in this regard, and then what your role is there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what I would say is, kind of in response to your first point, DIU is not focused on anything in particular. We are here to respond to emerging capability gaps that the warfighter has, go out into commercial partners or into industry, find technology that can, if not solve, help mitigate or address those issues, and bring it to bear within DoD on a commercial time frame measured in months, rather than a traditional program of record approach, which is measured in a decade. That's what we want to do now. Within that, I would say that the uncrewed system space in general, that's ground, maritime, surface, drones, counter UAS, electronic warfare, is a huge point of emphasis for DIU today. And that is because without fail across DoD, end users are very clear about the capability gaps they have, that they don't have ways to address what they know would be a need in a conflict with a peer. So that's what we're trying to do and what we're trying to go forward with.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the specific programs that you're involved with that are looking to kind of help in that, what you just mentioned as far as the mission and focus area?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, kind of knowing the general emphasis of your podcast, I would say that we have multiple programs and partnerships at DIU that kind of span the IC community as well as many others. But what we are doing today, I am the Blue UAS project manager. Blue UAS is a third way, a third entry point into DoD for uncrewed systems. Normally in DoD, you can enter via program of record or via an exception to policy, which is a very paperwork intensive, very tedious process with a lot of restrictions. Blue UAS was created about 5 years ago to go to the commercial market, verify and validate that components were in accordance with the law. There's various pieces of legislation to cover that, but essentially when we say in compliance with the law, we mean certain components can't come from China or Russia, North Korea, Iran, a couple others. But in this space, China makes 90+% of the global market, not just in drones, but in the key components as well. And then we do a cybersecurity analysis, which allows us to generate a piece of paper called an authority to operate. That ATO is what allows for use of our UAS platforms by operators across all of DoD without doing any other paperwork. If they have the funds, they can then go buy the platform or capability that they need if it's on the blue list. It's legal, it's fast. From start to finish, if there is an emerging need that a DoD end user comes to us and says, hey, we have a problem and we already have a capability, or they say, hey, here's the specific thing we need, in 45 days or less, we can do that process, verify, validate, and add it to the blue list, which then allows them to go out and legally purchase it. What that does is, it shortens not just by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, often 3 orders of magnitude, the time frame required for traditional response to an emerging need. And then, it kind of goes back to my earlier point. We're not the deciders. We choose things from the commercial market, but it's done by evaluators from across DoD. At our latest event in the fall, where we had a full competitive refresh of the Blue UAS list, evaluators from every service participated, and they were the ones who filled out the grading rubric, who got hands-on with the platforms, and allowed us to delineate between platforms and capabilities we wanted to add and what necessarily we didn't.
Can you maybe just provide a little perspective on the diversity of platforms that are currently in use across the military? I don't want to be unit specific or mission specific, but are we talking thousands or are we talking dozens? Kind of just like paint us a picture.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Brad. The analogy that I would use is one, I want to be clear. From where we sit, uncrewed systems have changed the way wars are fought, period. In a way that, you could go back to the introduction of the machine gun, fundamental changes in the way wars are fought at the tactical edge. Within DoD, we do not have platforms at mass, at quality, at producibility scales that would be needed in a true pure conflict. Ukraine today, you'll see estimates all over the place. It is a conservative estimate to say they are expending, meaning going through them completely, more than 150,000 UAS platforms a month. Somewhere going to be north of 2 million this year if the war continues. Within DoD today, if we were to exhaust our platforms at the same rate Ukraine does, the entire DoD inventory goes away in less than 4 days. And then we don't have a production capacity to rebuild that. 4 days in a conflict against a near peer, and that's it. A trusted colleague of mine recently visited a company in Ukraine, and this individual company has the capacity to make more than 4,000 drones every single day, dependent on supply chain. In this fiscal year, the entire DoD plans to buy less than 4,000 drones. So we have the Ukraine perspective. One single company in one day can make 4,000. DoD in 1 year plans to buy 4,000. And the math just doesn't add up. We are not preparing for the contested future that we have to. And the unfortunate truth is if we're called to go into combat, that 19-year-old kid on the front line is going to pay the price in blood. So that's what drives DIU, the team working on things from our end. We have to do better. That 19-year-old kid deserves the best. And to date, the folks that be, the powers allocating money, funds, budget within services have not made it a priority. We hear lip service paid to this. We don't see action. Because if you look at development timeframes in this space, I can point to a program started in 2007 with a requirements writing process. Current initial planned fielding of that capability, quantity 1 to units, not planned to finish until 2029 today. Like it just kind of boggles the mind from an outside perspective as well from the inside. And I can tell you that folks on the front lines know what they need. They are very clear about it. They're not getting it. I hear that on a daily basis from people.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
And before I sat down, I was looking at the bookshelf behind me, and I just glanced and saw that we have Kill Chain, sitting there, which, of course, was written by Christian Bros. And I can't even remember when. I think it was it's been a number of years, which essentially laid out the same problem that you just described. I want to read to you something. General Scott Miller recently shared an op-ed that we published on the Cipher Brief. And in it, he was sharing thoughts on the combination of artificial intelligence and drones in use in warfare. I'm just going to read one sentence because it ties with what you're saying there. He said, the technology is moving faster than most realize. And if you look at most of the solutions, we are on the wrong end of what he called the economic bell curve. So is it just a mindset problem, like you just said? Is it that, the defense industrial base, the Pentagon leadership has not yet said, we're going to make this a priority? Is it just that simple? The United States clearly has, sophisticated capabilities to produce. I was talking to a friend of mine who's still in the special operations community who was kind of saying, the United States can be sleepy. However, if we were to wake up and get really focused on this, we could turn on a dime. Now, that was his words and characterization of the problem. And certainly we're much different than Ukraine. But it seems as though now we are years into watching Ukraine evolve, produce at a scale that you just mentioned, while we are continuing down sort of paths that many people say is status quo. Like, what's the underlying issue?
I wish I could say it's a simple problem. The reality is, I think, we can separate it into 3 key things. Number one, there's policy. Policy is set by Congress, and we know there are interested people in Congress. You look at the legislation that's come out. But today, there are still some things that haven't been addressed. DJI, the Chinese dominant giant in this industry, controls somewhere north of 80% of the global UAS market. Chinese supply chain manufacturers in this space, 90+%. And depending on where you look, up to 100% for certain key things, approaching 100%. 99.5% rounds to 100. So there's the policy piece. The hardware piece, which I just talked about, things are made in China. And to your point, I am never going to undersell American ingenuity, capitalism, and the way we can respond, because we can. But to build a factory, to work out the bugs in production, to hire and train a workforce, that we can't do overnight. It takes time. And what our commercial partners tell us repeatedly is, if we give them firm demand over a period of years, then they can unlock the capital needed to invest, but they can't do it without that, because otherwise they're going to go out of business. So, hardware, policy, but then there's software. And, kind of to that AI piece you talked about, it's not just around having a great physical thing, and it's not just around the policy, but how do you integrate software capabilities to unlock the potential and the ease of use and operability by that end user to solve the problems they have on the battlefield, where we know electronic warfare is pervasive, where we know that there's counter UAS capabilities, where, if you've been there, you get wet, cold, tired, it's night, things get hard. And, when we say AI, it means a lot of things to a lot of people. From where I sit, we have to give the right software to take that cognitive load off of the operator to allow them to do what they need to do. It's as simple as maybe it's an algorithm that helps stabilize the platform when it's flying, or, that can detect and classify a thermal signature so that the operator doesn't have to see it and recognize it when it's 3 a.m. in the morning and you're tired because you haven't slept. There's a lot of ways that software comes into play. Things need to be intuitive. It's just like whether you have an Android or an iPhone, you pick the phone up and you can use it. There's some things you got to figure out, but it's intuitive and it's responsive. And one of the other key things that we know from Ukraine is, in order to succeed in this space, we've seen technological generations roughly every 3 months since that war started, almost a little more than 36 months ago. Key changes from the UAS and uncrewed space. To react that fast, we have to embed commercial partners in industry directly with our operational end users and allow them to iterate at that speed. We can do it. We have industry partners. We know they can do it. But today, DoD-wide, that's not what we're doing, because the money is tied up. That's not existing policy. There's bureaucratic roadblocks. And oh, by the way, I go back to my point, we're only going to procure 4,000 platforms a year.
Yeah, that's surprising, that number, to me. I mean, Suzanne and I have traveled to Ukraine a number of times over the last few years, and more recently, we had the pleasure of meeting a number of the units and the folks that are involved in the domestic drone industry there, which has, staggering numbers of production. Where they're not necessarily focused is on the commercial market, and we've had a lot of I'm just curious user of drones myself on the recreational side, and so you mentioned DJI, and it's enormous what they've done, the success that they've had on the commercial market. And when I sort of survey, both the Ukrainian side and then the US market, I don't see a concurrent interest in establishing commercial success with our drone industry. Is that a problem? And do you see that as a limiting factor in the development, especially with what you just said about the US government only going to procure 4,000 units? That's a significant headwind for development of the US drone industry.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think one way to look at it as, DJI makes an excellent product. They incorporate user feedback, thriving developer ecosystem. They're just easy, simple, and effective. And they're cheap. So if you were to compare, as best you can, an apples to apples, Chinese versus, US allies and partners, 4 to 5x the cost for that US option versus the Chinese option. And on the commercial market, the 4 to 5x cost is probably going to get you something that's not as good.
Right.
It's not as intuitive. It's harder to work. So this goes back to policy. And I want to be clear, like I don't set policy, that's for Congress. But as long as DJI is the dominant player in the US in the drone industry, we're not going to develop that ecosystem internally. There's just no way you can overcome that when DoD sales in this space represent less than 1% of the total drone market sales in the United States on a yearly basis. Like the math doesn't add up. So, we see encouraging signs. There's legislation that's been proposed. Again, we don't set policy, but I want to be clear from a national security perspective, we do view dependence on Chinese components as a vital threat.
Yeah. And we've talked already in this conversation a lot about Ukraine, and Ukraine does dominate this topic quite often, but we can't forget that there's other parts of the world, and the Indo-Pacific region certainly presents challenges for the U.S. military, both in terms of the rising power that China is and the near-peer adversary that you mentioned. On a conventional front, we've followed the stories here at the Cipher Brief for quite some time about China's investment in weapon systems meant to keep U.S. Navy at a standoff distance, for example. There's been a lot written recently about the U.S. effort to iterate and evolve unmanned systems for the Indo-Pacific region, which are going to require a different approach than Ukraine. Larger systems, longer, distances, longer loiter time, things like that. Are you involved at all in that? And can you share any perspective from DIU as it relates to other areas around the world, not just Ukraine?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. And one, I want to be clear, like we are aware of the needs around the world because combatant commands and services tell us. A recent project that we announced publicly about a month ago, we call Artemis, and it is intended for long-range one-way attack platforms. There's a variety of, what does that mean? Well, we have 2 shorter range platforms that we selected companies for prototyping for, but 2 longer range as in 1,000+ kilometer ranges, which, if you go and, just draw a circle on the map in the Indo-Pacific, like that becomes operationally relevant. One of the things we focused on is, I am a firm advocate of the fact that the way we fight wars have changed. In the uncrewed space, masked, affordable, attritable autonomy is what we have to have. So you can't pay $500,000 for a platform. You could pay maybe 50, but not 500. And so we focused on 2 of the companies that we're partnered with, U.S. firms partnered with Ukrainian hardware manufacturers, who were kind of where we think we've chosen a sweet spot of capabilities that can apply in EUCOM, that can apply in CENTCOM, that can also apply in INDOPACOM because of their affordability, because of their ease of launch, because of the facts that they carry the payloads that could be wanted, because they're simple and intuitive and can be dispersed. We think that also answers a need. And I want to be clear, the companies that we put on contracts, we're going to complete prototyping work with them by late May, early June of this year. At which point, assuming they're successful, we'll certify that. And then those options would be available within DoD for purchase immediately. Existing programs of record in the space, they have work ongoing. I think it's fair to say that their timelines for completion are nowhere close to ours, years further in the future. That doesn't mean that we're right. It doesn't mean that we're going to succeed. We're probably going to fail on some of those companies that we selected because we do. That's the nature of choosing and partnering with commercial firms. But we're going to iterate, and we think we made some good choices. And so, past DIU math holds, probably 2 of the 4 at a minimum are going to come out to be viable. In this case, we think likely higher because we aren't reinventing the wheel. We're taking existing solutions that have employment history, and we're updating them with some needed software capabilities to allow them to be more operationally relevant and effective. But yeah, I think to the point of INDOPACOM, it is always a relevant factor as well. We don't focus in one spot, but we wanted to provide cheap, affordable options that would be available in the very, very short term for that space.
That leads well into my last question. Speaking of the short term, we've seen some staggering headlines, mostly out of Ukraine, in terms of, unmanned systems reshaping the way wars are fought, as you've mentioned a few times already. I want to ask you as a follow-up, a two-part question. One, is there anything that I haven't asked that you'd like to share that's just really top of mind? And then what are you going to be watching most observant for over the next 12 months, to the extent that you can share with us in terms of milestones, achievements, or what else we may be, expect to see out of the Ukraine conflict as it relates to all of this?
Yeah. So what I would say, in answer to the first question is we are focused on the gaps that our end users have. And I've mentioned it before, but if we are called to go into combat tomorrow as a nation, we're going to have people die because they don't have what they need. And so we remain focused on providing them options, not perfect options, not world-beating options, but options that will allow them to train for, prepare, survive, and prevail in combat. That doesn't mean perfect, but it means now. And that is something that we focus on all the time. And then your question, what are we looking for in the next 12 months? We are a demand-driven organization. We respond to emerging demand, problem sets, capability gaps from our end user partners. That means we're not picking, but are we aware of what's going on? Yes. Do we follow closely developments in the uncrewed systems, the electronic warfare, the counter UAS space? Absolutely. And it's fair to say we're going to continue to focus efforts in those three areas. The specifics, you'll see change. To just use last year's Blue UAS refresh as an example, where we conducted a full competitive refresh of all the platforms on the list. Historically, we only had Group 1 and Group 2 UAS platforms. End users have been very clear that they needed first-person view or kamikaze drone options, that they needed some micro or nano drone options, that they wanted some Group 3 platforms that had longer time on station or more cargo capacity or things like that. We're in the process of adding all of those options to the blue list. We've also focused on modularity and unbundling. So providing options for different radios, sensors, software packages, cameras, for folks to pick and choose from in response to their unique needs. Because what we don't want to do is say, we know what's best and we're giving you what you want and that's all you get. That's a traditional program of record approach. We want to be a demand-driven organization. Much in the same respect, like if you go to the grocery store, you pick what you want off the shelf. And then if you don't pick it, the grocery store is going to put something new on the shelf in a couple months to give you a different option. That's the mindset we take. We're not going to get everything right, but we want to be a demand-driven and responsive organization that responds to emerging and evolving needs at the speed they do. We're not perfect. We haven't done what we need to do. And from where I sit, there's just so much to do because, I've said this 3 or 4 times, we owe more to the frontline soldier. We need to prepare them and equip them for combat, and we aren't doing that today.
And all of this has taken place against a backdrop of speed and emergence of threats that we've just never seen before. It's certainly a daunting mission. I think we can take great confidence that there are teams like yours out there focused on this, and this is certainly something that I think we're going to want to reach back out to you and talk again. I mean, the environment just simply changes so fast out there. So Trent, thank you very much for spending some time with us today. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure.